Welcome and good morning. My name is Julia Watson. I am the author of the Low Tech series published by Taschen. I am the co-founder of the Low Tech Institute and the director of the Office of Intercultural Urbanism. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, the Lenape people past and present, and I honor with gratitude both the land and the Lenape people. As an Australian-born, non-Indigenous person, I recognize the deep privilege of speaking to you today. Thank you so much to IFLA Africa for this incredibly kind invitation to offer you a keynote today in which to consider the role of landscape architects and allied professionals in reframing the African landscape and also in fostering climate resiliency and ecological justice. As a profession, we're being called to fundamentally reframe not just how we design, but who we design with and for. My work is rooted in a commitment to listening and learning and building right relationships with Indigenous knowledge systems and their communities. So, in my reflections on the theme, I'd like to offer a response through the lens of Indigenous science, regenerative design, and ancestral intelligence. And I'll explain my understandings of how millennia-old knowledge systems actually offer living blueprints for designing cities and infrastructures that coexist with rather than extract from the natural world. Today, I'd like to invite you on a journey into the past to envision a future that begins with a myth. Myth comes from the ancient Greek word mythos, meaning story of the people, and myths have guided mankind for millennia. One of the oldest mythological threads of the Earth's indigenous peoples is that humans are part of nature, and so are their technologies. But 400 years ago, intellectuals of the European Enlightenment, they constructed a myth that separated humans from nature. And this mythology of technology, it actually favored fuel by fire and it feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources to power the age of industrialization. It also ignored millennia-old wisdom, deeming it primitive. And this myth, it actually came to replace the traditional role of humans as the caretakers of the earth, and instead, we have now become its greatest threat. Today, the mythology of the dominant global culture focuses on either conquering nature in the name of progress or saving nature in the name of conservation, both subservient to either our superiority or our savior complex. However, humanity's real challenge is not to save nature, but to work with nature. And responding to this challenge is low tech. Low tech is a movement that considers local communities and their technologies as an evolutionary extension of life in symbiosis with nature. And as designers of the built environment, when looking to the past, we tend to focus because we've been taught that the ancient innovations of the dead cultures are the most interesting, like the 4,000-year-old pyramids of Giza, while completely failing to acknowledge the incredible innovations of living ancient cultures. Ancient cultures like those who first created these 4,000-year-old underground Qanat innovations. You can see pockmark along the surface of the earth, these underground aqueducts that travel through arid environments, conveying water, which actually birthed the city of Iran, the city of Tehran, sorry, and migrated halfway across the earth, allowing settlements to scale in arid landscapes. Or the 6,500-year-old Ahtala floating islands and muddy structures designed by the Madan, people of the southern wetlands of Iraq. These technologies are supported by ancient myth. And that myth of humans and nature supports 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. And in this 21st century, humankind's impact upon the Earth is causing a mass extinction, the Earth's sixth mass extinction. But I don't actually think that species extinction is what we'll remember the 21st century for. I think the greatest loss of the 21st century will be remembered as the time when we lost the most valuable climate technologies on this planet because we simply failed to recognize them. Because those same forces that are driving species extinction are actually endangering local innovations, which I call low tech. The word low tech is a combination of two words, local and TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, but it's also a provocation towards the biases that we have for traditional technologies. Because historically, these systems have been classified as low, LOW, tech, which is by dictionary definition defined as unsophisticated and primitive. When these technologies are neither, they're sophisticated innovations that include all of today's sustainability principles like low embodied energy, low impact, and low cost. They're actually exponentially generative systems, and they are governed by community-based collectives where the incentives lie in working together for the benefit of all species. What low tech really did is it questioned this dominant mythology of technology which threatens life, and it shows how humans can live and have thrived with nature. It really questions what we consider technology, and it asks whether some of our most sustainable innovations are rooted in cultures who figured out climate solutions a millennia ago. And these are innovations that have been passed down through generations in response to flood and fire and drought and sea level rise and severe weather events, the same crises that we are facing today. But these systems are actually incredibly well adapted to their environments, and they play a key role in conserving all of that global biodiversity. Systems like this one, that seemingly doesn't even look like a technology, but this is actually a picture of the Jisur of the Amasir in Tunisia, who have developed an incredibly sophisticated terracing technology to capture really scarce amounts of waters that travel through these valleys by rainfall and to capture them so that there can be an intense form of agriculture within these terraces in really arid mountain landscapes. So low-tech uses TEK. TEK, which is knowledge that has really been universally either ignored or exploited by Western science. And TEK is defined as a cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. So if we diagram TEK, it really can be most easily understood as a system of nested concepts that explain the construction of the world around an individual. And and that world is composed of one's local knowledge of land and ecosystems, one's land and resource management systems, social institutions, and also this worldview or a belief system. And that belief system is told through a myth. And at the foundation of that myth is an understanding that humans are an integral part of nature. And so radical indigenism is actually the byline of the book, designed by Radical Indigenism. And it's a philosophy of Professor Eva Marie Garut. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she really argues for a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of indigenous philosophies capable of generating new knowledge and dialogues for indigenous communities. And in low tech, I apply this philosophy to the fields of design and sustainability, arguing for a new look at indigenous mythologies and local technologies to inform sustainability and climate innovation. And as a designer, I actually know that solutions that are embedded in community and in their environment are the most effective forms of resilience at scale. And low tech is really a movement that builds upon that understanding of these local solutions to generate sustainable, climate resilient new infrastructures and futures. So, in response to the theme of the conference, I really I agree that our role as designers is to create and to reframe the landscape, and we can do this by creating a new mythology of technology for the built environment, guided by values and principles and techniques of indigenous African innovation. I'm going to show you an example of one of those innovations from India. The Wakasi people of Northeast India, they live in a forest that receives more rainfall than any other place on Earth, and they've evolved this incredibly amazing bridging innovation called the Living Root Bridge. It's made from Ficus elastica trees, and these are the only bridges that are able to withstand the force of the incredibly fast-flowing monsoon rains that flood these river systems. And the bridges, they're created by guiding and growing tree roots, secondary root system of the Ficus elastica tree, through a scaffolding of bamboo that forms a bridge. And these are bridges that you can barely wrap your arms around. And they are woven, the roots are woven through this really carefully wrapped scaffolding of bamboo. This particular process is a 1,500-year-old tradition of growing living root bridges and ladders, and it's produced over 75 structures that take 50 years to grow, but in this landscape, they actually last for centuries. And what happens is multiple generations of Khasi men take care of the roots until they've grown to the opposite bank, where they're planted to form a structure that only really gets stronger with age. With some of our most imminent threats to communities arising from water, low-tech's sequel, which is titled Water, a Field Guide for Technology. This book documents both aquatic ancestral technologies and contemporary projects that are infused with TEK and use it as their foundational thinking. But this book is also a call to design living rather than dead cities. And dead cities is really, at this point, what we have. But how do we even end up with dead and lifeless cities? Well, at the dawn of modernism, Louis Sullivan declared that form follows function. And this happened in the late 19th century. And at the time, this was incredibly revolutionary. It was a call to strip ornament and design cities and buildings that mirrored the efficiency of machines. Cities were being reimagined as these incredible engines of innovation that were powered by coal and steel and this pure industrial ambition. And as these skyscrapers soared and streets were cemented for miles, urban expansion just it raced forward on this assumption that efficiency itself was the measure of progress. And today, in cities all over the world, we can see that this experiment has failed. It gave us forms that function, but really rarely forms or cities that thrived. And cities have become these rigid and mechanical and incredibly extractive. They exhaust the ecosystems, they displace cultures, they bury their rivers and their wetlands. So, what modernism gained in efficiency, it just destroyed in life. And so, to replace form follows function and alignment with an indigenous mindset, Water proposes a new edict for the 21st century. Form follows flux, meaning that the forms we design must respond to the constant state of continuous flow, transformation, and change rather than a fixed and static condition. Like the fish traps of the Yapis in this image that is shaped like an arrow out to sea, and it works under the flux of the tides. And These are the forms that we need today, and they cannot be static. They must be responsive. They must be adaptive. They must be adaptive with water, but also with climate and with culture and with the rhythms of life itself. Arthur C. Clarke's famous words remind us of life's true foundation. How inappropriate to call this planet Earth when it's quite clearly ocean. And even to this day, in many, many traditions across the globe, water is considered kin, it is considered an ancestor, it is a teacher. It is not considered just a resource to control, but it is a foundational relationship to nurture. And if we look at cities across the globe, we can actually identify cities that once co-evolved with water, like the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, that is pictured in this aerial. It is a metropolis of more than 200,000 people with a tribute of 5 million, floating in complete harmony with its lakes. Its canals and chanapas were actually living infrastructure. They're adaptive and productive, and they're really deeply connected to the ecological cycles of its waters. Now, in Mexico City, the chanapas that were designed first by the Nahua, and then they were later expanded by the Aztecs, as shown in that aerial before, they were not simply floating gardens as they're most commonly described, but they were incredibly sophisticated, raised agricultural fields. They were built layer by layer, and that layering system included mud and reeds and actually living willow trees. And this was a technology of abundance. It produced harvests of up to 8 times a year and soils fertile for centuries. But the actual genius of the Chinapas was never just food. They purified water, they sheltered the axolotl, the frogs, the birds, they cooled the city, they buffered against flooding and drought. They carried people and goods along their canals much faster than roads. So this was not infrastructure versus ecology. It was really both at once, completely woven together. So imagine a city like centuries ago functioning as this really living, breathing organism that was sustained by water. And the most powerful part of this entire system that we haven't even got to yet is that a really small part of this system is still alive in Xochimilco in Mexico City. There's still 5,000 acres of chinapas that continue to feed the city, to filter its water, and actually remind us of what regenerative design looks like. And in fact, the chinapas today, the small fragment that is left, they clean nearly half of Mexico City's wastewater, a service that actually no modern wastewater treatment plant could replicate so elegantly. So when we talk about the future of cities, cities that are facing heat and floods and water scarcity, the answer is not only in new technologies, it is in remembering what was created before, centuries ago. And I'm not talking about nostalgia, I'm talking about blueprints for future resilience. Because this is an image of Mexico City today, where once this city thrived before colonization, Mexico City sits now sinking, its rivers buried, with just a really small vestige of the Chinapa system left, and the rest of this aquatic city, which once was, now suppressed beneath this endless urban sprawl. And what happens when water dies? It takes worlds with it. And so when we talk about technology today, most people think of silicon chips and satellites and AI. But if we look further back, hundreds and even thousands of years, we actually see another kind of dominant technology. These are technologies like the Kayan Nilam, which is a sub-sea level farming system here, and this is a farming system, and they're systems developed by ancient cultures designed not to control nature, but to co-create with it. Technologies that have endured because they are inherently resilient, and designed in response to flux like floods. Another system, like the hydrodynamic knowledge system, here passed down from ear to ear and hand to hand across generations, resisting extinction, offering their wisdom about water, systems powered by the celestial movements that energize tides, like the Ramli agricultural sand islands of the Amasya in Tunisia. Again, another technology here of the Amasya, which support lush gardens in an inhospitable, salty, and sandy lagoon environment. Or like infrastructures energized by the solar rays that siphon wild salt in the Michike Agor salt pans of the Goans, that transform into sponge-like marshes to absorb floodwaters during the monsoon and then protect the cities that lie behind them. So this system actually becomes a deep wetland system in the monsoonal season. Or damming infrastructures constructed from branches and mud along river corridors like the Nguma fish weirs of the Baka people in Cameroon, which completely disappear within hours. To terracing systems that are powered to capture small, tiny amounts of water in arid environments. To systems that are made by the metapolics of material decay, supporting the buoyancy of bioagricultural islands. These islands are constructed from invasive water hyacinth, and they snake through the waterways, rising with the monsoon and then settling back into the earth in the dry season. And when they settle back to the earth, they naturally nourish and replenish the soils with nutrients. So these are incredibly cyclical, adaptive systems that sustain life. They filter rivers, they revitalize lands, and they support native ecosystems. To new systems that are being designed using traditional ecological knowledge, like the Eden Iraq wastewater treatment park in the southern wetlands of Iraq, in the city called Chabayish. It's a new regenerative water cleansing system being constructed by the Madan people from the same endemic species used to construct their 6,500-year-old Al Talaq floating islands. Or the Great Green Wall, leveraging multiple communities' traditional ecological knowledges across the Sahel to regenerate lands and reverse desertification. Modernity builds against water by fortifying the sea, by burying rivers, and by draining wetlands. By regenerating ancestral innovations, as in not only about food, but this is about rerouting cities in seasonal cycles and building with the earth's breath. And we must see these systems and the cities birthed by them with new eyes, not as relics. These are blueprints, working systems that continue to evolve and sustain life. And if we pay attention, they may actually guide the regeneration of urban systems. What if nature was reframed as the architect and culture as the engineer? And what if infrastructure was taught to collaborate and not colonize? Traditional ecological knowledge actually holds answers to many of the questions that cities are grappling with. And so, what if this is already happening? Across the world, the visionary designers are no longer inventing, they are listening. They are turning to TEK not as novelty, but as absolute necessity. So, what if the next century of design isn't about conquering or controlling nature, but partnering with it and listening to it and learning from it to co create systems like the Sanjiotang Polder Dike system, which creates a circular system of mulberry tree silkworm fish farming that also offers an incredible system of flood protection for the city of Huzhou in China. And now these systems like these are being co-located with vast fields of photovoltaics, offering completely new models for ancestral systems and renewable technologies to work in symbiosis. And so where form follows flux, cities are now being designed not as machines, but as living systems that flow with water and with culture and with climate. Like the Nanchang Fishtail Park by Touriscape in China, that's inspired by systems like the previous one that I showed, which is the Sanjiatang. Cities that move and breathe and respond rather than resist the world that is rapidly changing around them. So, what if cities could remember their completely unique dynamic forces, the shifting rhythms of water and the seasonal pulses of land, and the stories and the knowledge embedded in the people who have shaped a place? And what if the next century of design, it's not about conquering or controlling nature, but partnering with it and listening to it and learning from it, like the Thammasat University in Bangkok by Land Process. Imagine designing with ancestral memory, the memory of water, the memory of the land, and the collective wisdom of generations who have lived before. The tools that exist, the wisdom is alive, and Indigenous knowledge, regenerative design, and ecological science, it is all here and it's already being used to shape our most innovative urban water resilient projects like this one, which is a Sanya Mangrove Park designed by Touriscape, which is a model of the sponge city. So if we truly listen to water and to its memory, to its intelligence, but also to its dire warnings, we can co-create cities that do more than just function. We can create cities that thrive with life and that remind us of our place in coexistence with this living planet. So I ask you as designers and planners and policymakers and as educators and as planetary citizens, how will your city remember? And when we ask how our cities will remember, we're also asking how we can carry forward technologies that already exist in living memory. And that's why I co-created the Low Tech Institute and the office, these two platforms that allow us to work at the intersection of research and education and practice. So through the Low Tech Institute, we've built a research and education platform to help preserve and scale Indigenous technologies. The Living Earth curriculum is our way of teaching regenerative design through traditional ecological knowledge. And our aim is to work in reciprocity with communities, ensuring these practices are not just remembered, but passed on to future generations. We are not a traditional school. We are teaching teachers, and we are building a new kind of planetary literacy and planetary leadership. The Low Tech office is our living studio. It is co-led by Indigenous and non-Indigenous designers and scientists, and we are guided by a majority Indigenous Global Advisory Council, which ensures cultural and ecological integrity across all our work. And together, we translate TEK into contemporary urban projects, policy, public exhibitions, and material systems by designing climate adaptive infrastructures and reimagining urban systems as living collaborators. This is what we call intercultural urbanism. It is collaborative, it is regenerative, and it is rooted in reciprocity. In our work and in the Low Tech series, we describe a vision where design doesn't follow function, but flux, constant transformation, reciprocity, and change. This is technological urbanism. Our mission is to show that Indigenous knowledge is not a relic of the past, but a living innovation that can guide cities and communities towards regenerative and resilient futures. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best and most wonderful conference across the next 2 days. Thank you.